Okay, great. Okay, great. So yeah, let's dive right in. So welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Michelle Coates-Mather. I am the Executive Director of the Canadian Transportation Alliance. I want to begin this webinar by respectfully acknowledging that the CTA is broadcasting to you from the unceded and traditional territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. So I'm really delighted to see so many CTA member representatives join us here today. And welcome all of you who are new to the CTA, who are engaging with us for the very first time. Before we jump into the crux of our discussion, the consumer insights that we're about to unveil, a quick intro into the CTA for those of you who are unaware. So we are a nonpartisan, non-advocacy, transportation, energy inclusive research and education organization. That energy inclusive piece is really important. So our growing membership represents the continuum of transportation energy markets. So that includes hydrogen, electricity, biofuels, renewables, and traditional fuels. So our members have made a commitment to each other to work collaboratively to develop objective, data-driven, fact-based research and analysis to both help inform governments, consumers, and business leaders on all pathways to immediate and long-term low-carbon road transportation solutions. So no easy feat, lots of work to be done, but we're working very collaboratively together. So today we are focusing on the consumer aspect of our mandate. Part of our effort is really to help our membership and other industry and government decision makers figure out how to effectively engage Canadians in this net zero discussion, in this energy transition discussion, specifically how it impacts the vehicles that we purchase or will be purchasing in the future, or corporate and commercial vehicles that we may be using down the road. Really, to help inform and drive action, to educate and empower consumer purchase choice. But to do that, we really need to take a step back and put our assumptions and our biases aside to really understand where Canadians are in this discussion, what they know and don't know, how engaged they are. So to get to the bottom of this, we engaged our research partner, Abacus Data, to perform a survey with the goal of addressing a very basic but important question. Do Canadians know what net zero means? How familiar are they with this concept? So you might be asking, so what? Who cares? Who cares if they're informed or not informed, so long as the environmental benefits are achieved? Well, here's the obvious answer to that question. And at the risk of sounding completely trite, Canadian consumers literally hold the key to low carbon road transportation adoption. So, in our grand policy discourse, we can't take for granted the importance of engaging Canadians in the net zero discussion in a really practical way. And the best way to do that, of course, again, is through data and research. So with that context in mind, it's my great pleasure today to introduce you all to Oksana Kishchuk, Director Strategy and Insights with Abacus Data, who is going to walk us through some of the results of our commissioned research and some data points that sort of further inform the conversation. Before I turn it over to Oksana, I'm gonna, take myself off screen so that she can have complete focus. But I just want to note that you are most welcome to submit questions at any time during the presentation, and I will do my best to get to all of them at the very end of Oksana's presentation, and we'll have a bit of a discourse then. So with that in mind, Oksana, welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Michelle. I'm just going to do the classic share my screen, make sure everything is working well, and looks like we're on. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today and share some data points related to this work. My name is Oksana. As mentioned, I'm the Director of Strategy and Insights at Abacus Data. I'm based here in Ottawa, and very excited to share some of the results here today. Just a bit of an agenda of what we're going to get through this afternoon. First, I think it's important, no matter what presentation we're giving with data, to really set the context about where Canadians' minds are at with some of the issues related to what we're going to talk about, but more generally, what's on their minds and sort of what's framing all conversations, including this one. Then we'll get into some data on impressions of net zero specifically, where Canadians are at in their knowledge, and what does that mean for perceptions of net zero targets here in Canada. And then lastly, we'll have a little bit of a conversation about net zero and knowledge and familiarity with the concept more generally, and then how that impacts the consumer vehicle market and perceptions on things like choice, options, and future purchasing decisions. So just to get into it a little bit, I know we're a market research and polling firm, so we have sort of all sorts of data, horse race numbers, all of that. But I think for this context, I think it's really important to set the stage a little bit on where Canadians' minds are, more specifically as it relates to some of the issues that are worrying them, things that keep them up at night, and where kind of their mindset is on when governments set goals and targets and priorities, and how that relates to their own realities at home. So first is a slide that I like to share often, which is whether Canadians think the world or Canada is on the right or the wrong track. I think it really sets the stage for sort of mindset and an outlook on a number of issues. And so as you can see, not a lot of optimism in the country right now on where things are headed with the world, but also the same can be said for Canada. More than not, Canadians say that both Canada and the world is heading on the wrong track. So really framing that kind of perception and mentality about policy decisions and consumer decisions at home. Another sort of contextual piece that I think is really worth understanding are some of the top issues that Canadians are prioritizing, and how that's changed and evolved even in the last, I want to say 6 months, but especially in the last couple of years, through COVID, through environmental issues, and the financial picture of how things are. Canadians' issues, or the issues that are important to Canadians, have been changing rapidly, and Canadians are sort of reprioritizing things. So on the slide in front of you are the top issues that were front and center leading into the last federal election that we had. So you can see the question asked folks to pick the top 2 issues that were most important to their vote, and you can see that there's cost of living is at the top, as is healthcare system. Even before the times we had in the last couple of years, these 2 issues have topped the charts. You can see that climate change and reducing carbon emissions is something that is fairly close in the race with those other 2 top issues. It's number 3, and it's fairly close in terms of percentage points to the issues that Canadians are caring about and taking to the ballot. If you look at where things are at today, there's a little bit of a different picture. You can see that there's quite a bit of a bigger spread in what the top issues are, and a real sort of ranking, clear-cut rank of where Canadians stand. So this data was taken from just a few weeks ago. The rising cost of living is still at the top of the charts. However, it is really up there at the top, followed by healthcare, housing affordability and accessibility, and the economy have sort of jumped ahead of climate change and are really taking sort of front and center issues that Canadians are thinking about. And so I think this is sort of an important piece of the conversation to understand sort of the issues that Canadians are thinking about when it comes to the choices they make, or how they view policy decisions, or how they view sort of support or opposition for the direction that governments have taken. That the context really matters. Climate change is increasing in importance at 28%, which is higher than it has been in recent months, I think due to a number of the events that have taken place in Canada, unfortunately, over the last couple of months that have really brought that issue to the forefront. However, I think it's really important to note that that spread is still very much present in the data today. One last sort of point on that, just to drive that home, of just how important cost and sort of the economy are, at least for a little while longer. is that the majority of Canadians feel that they're living within their means, but paycheck to paycheck, 15% say they're living beyond their means. And this number is much higher among younger Canadians, many of whom are typically more supportive of issues like climate change or addressing environmental pieces with government action. So just some sort of important context setting pieces there that sort of frame the next piece of our conversation. So one of the key pieces of the work that we did for CTA was to understand Canadians' impressions of net zero. Not so much the specifics of the plan and if they liked them or not, or those sorts of things, but really to understand a nice solid benchmark baseline understanding of, do Canadians understand what it is? And so what we found, I think, is very interesting and really sort of speaks to the importance, first, that knowledge is key and is a very important sort of base piece to have into building support and even adoption for a lot of these policies, and that policy information does not always equal information in practice or how Canadians can connect targets to their lives and their own understanding of these terms. So we asked Canadians, are they familiar with the net zero emissions by 2050? And so what we found was, overall, if we gather sort of a broad category, 71% can fall in the camp of familiar with this term, with what this means. However, if you look kind of at the bottom there, for the most part, most aren't very familiar with it. In fact, the way that they would describe their familiarity is that they've heard of it, but they don't really know what it looks like. And so what this means is that a lot of these terms and these phrases are used quite a bit and talked about, but if you were sort of sitting around at your family dinner table and having this conversation about, have you heard of this? Do you know what it is? Most people would say yes. But if you tried to have a conversation about, well, what does it really mean? Or what does it look like in practice? For the majority of Canadians, they wouldn't be able to take that conversation any further. And so this has an impact on a number of different sort of pieces to Canadians' understanding and perceptions of net zero. We also asked some other questions about whether or not this is something folks support, don't support, or are unsure. You can see that there's most support. There's a little bit of lack of support there, but there's a good number of folks who are unsure about whether or not they support this, likely due to a lack of familiarity. There's also a little bit of disconnect on the impact on things like the economy. So 45% say there'll be a positive impact with these targets, 28% say negative, and then 27% say unsure. So again, there's a bit of that disconnect about knowledge enough to have a solid understanding about what it looks like in practice, and to be able to form opinions beyond just the target itself and what it means for things like the economy, what it means for things like their choices. We also asked folks whether or not they say that these targets are realistic or not. And this is where we start to see a little bit more hesitation. 30% say realistic, 42% say not so much, and there's that sort of third of folks that express uncertainty again. This slide, I think, really captures a little bit more of that point that I'm really trying to drive home about the importance of familiarity. So not only just looking at these results sort of by overall responses, but looking at them when we apply sort of that familiarity lens. So the numbers in green are the responses from folks that are familiar. The yellow are the so-sos, and then the numbers in red are folks who are not self-declared not at all familiar with what net zero emissions by 2050 is. And as you can see, there's a really distinct fallout in responses here. So you can see that the more familiar folks are with the term, the more supportive they are. And the less familiar they are, the more likely they just are to be uncertain about whether their support is there or whether it is not for this target. We see similar results when we ask about the consequences of net zero emissions by 2050. Positive scores are higher for those who are more familiar, and then a higher level of uncertainty for those who have a lower level of familiarity with what this term means. And the same, I think, can be said for realistic, although as with sort of the top line numbers, this looks a little bit different. Even for folks who are familiar or self-declared familiar, there's still a little bit of uncertainty about whether or not the targets are realistic or not. And I think that perhaps speaks to the fact that there's sort of a bit of a ladder about whether or not you support, whether or not you think they'll have an impact, and then whether or not you believe that the targets are realistic or not, and just how important familiarity is in reaching sort of levels of support or saying that these targets are realistic, that it's likely that even those who say they're quite familiar with the targets might not entirely understand themselves what's all there and whether or not there's plans and practices in place to get there. We also looked at net zero emissions and the consumer vehicle market, and to understand sort of the relationship between understanding and familiarity with net zero, and then also what that sort of translates to when it comes to consumers' own decisions. We asked the same question about whether or not you're familiar with the term, yes or no, and then on that scale. And we can see very similar, if not near identical results with clean fuels. Again, we have about 70% of Canadians that could be placed in that familiar camp, but like the net zero emissions by 2050, most of them fit in that camp of I've heard of it, but I couldn't actually explain what it is or what's classified as a clean fuel. And I think that is also summarized by this slide here, where we see very high levels of folks who say that they're not sure when it comes to specifics. So we asked folks to say whether or not they believe each of these types could be net zero emissions or not net zero emissions. There's a whole wide range of scales, whether it's yes or no for folks. But I think for me, the most important piece of information on this slide is just how high some of those unsures are. Folks tend to like to believe that they know information, and so offering up a not sure is common for about 20% of the population, often on surveys, but for 50% of Canadians to be uncertain or unwilling to take a guess about things like biofuels or flex fuel, about whether or not they believe it can or can't be net zero emissions, is quite high, and I think speaks to just how much room there is to grow in terms of Canadians' knowledge about this conversation, this topic, and how their choices as consumers can help meet these targets and influence a lot of the work that's being done. Like some of the earlier conversations and questions, we also wanted to understand sort of how impressions of net zero impact Canadians' perceptions of the market of vehicles that will be available to them. And so according to consumers, there's this belief that this target will lead to higher vehicle prices, not necessarily lower vehicle prices, but also, again, there's still that big camp that is unsure about the consequences of these targets. So a lot of sort of room to grow and work to be done on influencing and educating consumers about sort of what net zero emissions by 2050 will mean for them as consumers, as there's a lot of uncertainty there. The other piece that I thought was quite interesting to look at is the impact of perceptions of choice. We asked folks to say whether or not they think that net zero emissions by 2050 will lead to more vehicle choice or less vehicle choice, or whether or not they're unsure. And you can see that there's still a high degree of uncertainty, but there's a good deal of Canadians that are concerned that these targets and these actions and sort of working towards these goals will lead to less options for them as consumers. So really interesting to understand, and I think important to understand where Canadians are at with their knowledge, but then also sort of with their perceptions and how it looks. I think understanding there's sort of two pieces that really come to light, is that knowledge is important and not near at the level where it could be, and there's lots of room to grow on that, but also that there's that second piece, that sort of translating that base knowledge about, I know what this word means and I can describe it in policy language, and taking that to that practical side. So what does that mean when I understand what these targets are? What does that mean for me as a consumer? What does that mean for the decisions that I'm making today, the decisions that I'll be able to make in the future, and the choices that will be sort of available to me when we're trying to hit these targets. So a few final sort of pieces that I think sort of sum up a lot of the results that I've shared, and things that I think that are important to keep in mind as we continue these conversations and continue looking at sort of awareness and understanding of these terms and these practices, and as hopefully they continue to grow. Is that cost is a bigger factor than climate for at least a little while longer. A lot of that sort of centers around some of that context data that I shared earlier, and that cost of living is much more sort of top of mind issue than climate for a number of Canadians, although the scales are starting to level up there. But just to sort of keep in mind that a lot of these conversations that Canadians are willing to have will be couched in this, and that climate isn't necessarily the first reason that they're going to make a choice as a consumer, or the first thing that they think about when they think about support or opposition for policies. Cost is still very much top of mind. The next is that knowledge influences perception, and that sort of those familiarity scales and those different sort of colors really show that the more Canadians are familiar with what these concepts mean, the more likely they are to form impressions, and more likely to form positive impressions and supportive impressions. And just how important it is to continue to share information about these, and not just using these terms, but really increasing Canadians' understanding more deeply about what exactly these mean, the why, the what, how. All of those are important pieces that Canadians will be looking to hear about. And then the last sort of takeaway is that consumers, at least at the moment, seem to lack clarity on net zero overall. And then, like I sort of mentioned earlier, those two pieces, if they lack that first piece about what it means in practice, it's really hard to understand what it means in practice for themselves as consumers in their everyday lives. I think perhaps some folks on the call here, I'll put myself in this group, are very much in the weeds a lot of the time with policies. We know a lot about government and all of these sorts of decisions and the lingo and the way that things are discussed. But when that comes time to be translated to the average everyday Canadian, and their understanding where they're coming from, or exactly how it will influence their day-to-day decisions outside of their job, that just isn't there yet. And there's a lot of room to grow on that piece. And so on that last note, I just wanted to share a little bit of a story of my own personal sort of experience with this topic, and then we'll get into some questions here. But I am originally from Saskatoon, and I actually embarked with my father on a cross-country road trip in an EV. My first non going to the gas station road trip that I took, and I sort of charted my journey across the country from Saskatoon to Ottawa on social media for some of my friends to follow along. Also, not a lot to do in Northern Ontario, if any of you have traveled through. Beautiful, not a lot of places to stop along the way. And I sort of described what this experience was like as a consumer purchasing an alternative vehicle, and what that really looked like. And what I really found was that even amongst a lot of my network and friends who are very much involved in these policy conversations, there's still that policy to practice conversation that is very much needed and is very much not there. There was a number of folks that sort of reached out to understand exactly, they understand sort of these policies, but what does it really look like in practice to use these kinds of vehicles or to make these kinds of consumer decisions? That was something that folks, even who deal with these files a lot, were still sort of looking to understand. And so I think there's still that gap. It starts with knowledge, it starts with understanding targets, but it also starts and transitions into communicating what that means for consumers' choices, what it means for their options, and what it means for the reality to the future. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of the results, and I'll open the floor back up to Michelle and any questions.
I was muted. I feel like we just circled back to pandemic times. You're on mute. Thank you very much for this, Oksana. I thought that was great and really important information. So again, I think there's a couple of key takeaways for me, and I think for us all who are listening into this call. The first one is industry, government decision makers, private sector businesses, folks and advocates who are engaged in transportation energy transition. We have work to do, because this gap between, I'm going to call it sort of like the big picture policy communications jargon, isn't landing at the consumer level. And so if we want to be able to reach not just our 2050 targets, but the interim targets that we have mapped out for ourselves, we have to figure out how to fix that today. So, and I think what strikes me most, a good example of that would be the debate around biofuels, and going back to some of the question on clean fuels that you mentioned earlier, as folks don't really see those biofuels, renewables, fitting into that space, which is really interesting because of course they're a pathway that we have today to decrease road transportation emissions. Literally today, we could start bringing those emissions down by incorporating more biofuel blending. So anyway, I think what strikes me is the need to be really practical in what those sort of consumer leading campaigns will look like. There are folks across industry that are taking the initiative to really engage and promote what that pathway will look like. And I think that's really important. But this baseline knowledge, we have to understand it and not take it for granted, because it's really not as intuitive as people might think. So I want to thank you very much for that. I'm just turning over. I have a question here, so we're going to just sort of leave. So what language has been landing in terms of communicating terms around life cycle emissions? That's interesting. I don't know if Abacus has done any work around life cycle emissions. Do you have a sense or anything you want to add to that, Oksana?
Yeah, so we have not tested sort of that phrase, and we only did sort of look at the concept of net zero generally in this work. But I would say, if I were to take a guess, that folks wouldn't know much about what that term means either. I think a lot of it is taking that conversation about less about sort of what the objective is. I think that a lot of folks would say that's the government's job, is to get us there. But what does that mean for my everyday choice? Explain to me how it's different. What is net zero? When you say net zero, what does it look like when I'm on my drive to work? What does my commute look like? How is that different? Talking about that piece, I think, is really important to getting through to consumers, less so about sort of the technology behind it or the sort of long-term objective, but more about the how is that going to impact me in my everyday life.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because again, life cycle emissions, that to me is again, it's industry jargon. We know it. But if you're meeting somebody for coffee, a Tim Horton is your neighbor, you're having this conversation, they're not talking about life cycle emissions. They're talking about, can I afford an EV in 2 years when I go to make my next purchase, or the cost of gas right now when I go to the pumps, and are renewables even something that I have access to right now? These are maybe the questions that they're willing to talk about. But I think that's a really interesting point. I have another question here, actually, I think is really interesting. So Can you, Oksana, clarify when you asked about what direction Canada is going, was it general or specific to environment or climate change?
Yeah, for sure. So that comment or that slide was related to Canada generally. So overall, not just on environment, but how are things going? I think that in a sense it is tied to environment because environment tends to be one of those top issues. At the moment, I think that direction outlook is very much driven by the cost conversation, but also tied to how Canadians think the government is doing and performing on those issues that they care about most.
Yeah, that's interesting. Another great question here. So were there any significant variances in familiarity by geographic region?
Yeah, so we found that overall, in terms of kind of that heard of it but don't really know what it looks like camp, that group tends to sit fairly evenly across the country. Those in Atlantic Canada are a little bit more quite familiar with what it means, but overall, there's a general sense that no one group in particular, perhaps policymakers and folks in the industry, but aside from those, are not any more familiar than most with what these terms mean.
So that really sort of drives home the earlier point about us having, we have work to do. Because that means that we're not just targeting certain regions. I mean, yes, messages need to be targeted based on the population, of course, and the audience you're communicating with. But really, it means that there's a big lift to be done here across every province and territory in this country to help educate Canadians and engage them in the process. Like, what does this mean to them? How is it practical to them? So lots of work to be done here. Any other final comments from you, Oksana? I'll just give it a moment too. If anybody, I've got another question. I've got perfect timing. So the comment here is greenflation appears to be impacting everyone. Given there is no logical or viable alternative, what framework has been presented to government net zero advocates that may or may not understand the overall impacts? Increased taxation is not the answer, nor is promoting restrictive or alternatives that are not available en masse. So I might just jump in first, and then Oksana, I welcome your feedback on that. So I'm cognizant here because, again, our alliance, we are not an advocacy association. There's a lot of great associations out there, such as the Canadian Fuels Association, the Canadian Energy Marketers Association, Advanced Biofuels, and others who are doing great advocacy work in this space and sort of asking these tough questions. So I think this really comes down to what we're seeing right now happening in Canada, the focus on, layering on regulation with taxation policy. Regardless of your personal opinions about it's not new. It's happening in jurisdictions around the world. And I think largely because we're all grappling with how is this actually going to get us to where we want to be? But again, I would just circle back and encourage those that are tuning in today, definitely follow up with these advocacy associations that are doing work in this space because they have a lot of important things to say and add to that part of the conversation. Oksana, anything from you, especially on the taxation piece? Is there anything that you wanted to share what you guys are seeing?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting sort of conversation and a question that we could spend much more time on it and really get into, like you said, the advocacy and stuff, but we'll stay out of that territory for now. And I think from my perspective, just understanding perceptions of what this means, I think is really important. I think no matter which direction that is taken, I think it's really clear that Canadians need to be informed about sort of the basics about why it is or exactly what it is or how it is, no matter sort of the direction, is that to understand why decisions are being made that are influencing them as consumers and what exactly that sort of trickle down impact looks like to them, to stay informed.
Yeah. Really, it's really interesting. So I think we have time for one or two more questions. So the next one that I have here is, did the results in any way sort of gauge whether Canadians see upfront vehicle cost, purchase price, and total lifetime ownership costs differently? I don't know that we went that far down, but your perspectives, Oksana, on that.
Yeah, so I'd be fascinated to see the results of that too. I think we did not dive that deep into it. I think it's more about that sort of top of mind. Will it be more expensive or less expensive for you? And I think that overall sort of feedback sort of could probably guide our answer in this question. That I think that there's a lack of knowledge in what I mean, people know what these vehicles cost up front. They can Google it, they can see the price tag, but I think that total lifetime ownership cost piece is something that folks don't know either. And it goes back to that knowledge conversation about that folks just need to be more educated about what is out there and how to make those decisions, and that they're likely basing their opinions on sort of the purchase price, and then anecdotally what they've heard from family and friends. Sort of back to that piece that I gave about my own experiences, that people just don't have enough familiarity with what these things look like, or even the terms generally, and so there's just a lot of knowledge work to be done there.
Yeah. And again, I think it makes sense that that is the focus, because again, when we do these types of surveys, this kind of research, it's a moment in time based on sort of the competing pressures that consumers are facing. And we've mentioned, or you've mentioned, sorry, several times throughout this presentation, cost and affordability are a key component to that. But you're right, at some point, we'll be hopefully out of an inflationary period, things will settle down. And then the question becomes, what are the long-term economic benefits to the transition in low carbon vehicle choices, so that sort of gets to that total lifetime ownership cost. Whether or not Canadians are willing to think that far ahead right now, I'm skeptical, candidly, because most are just focused on how am I going to pay my mortgage or what have you. So, but that time will come. So if we can start laying those foundational pieces now as an industry, what that looks like for them. And again, cutting through the noise, like this is about just putting forward the facts. Let's, put aside those biases that we all have, because we're all sitting on different sides of the spectrum. But I think everybody who is meaningfully engaging in this conversation is doing so because they are working to advance this transition in a way that is practical and actionable. So all that to say, I think this research work that you guys have done, that Abacus Data has done for the CTA, is really important. And I think it's very informative, both for our members, but for the industry and government writ large. So Oksana, I want to thank you again for taking the time today to join us. I might actually just, Oksana, if you don't mind just putting up that sort of last slide again, because I'd like to just do one final shout out, if I may, to the CTA. So just to remind folks, please go to ctaalliance.ca, take a look at our insights section, so you can download all of our research projects that have been done to date. We've covered everything from EV infrastructure adoption at retail sites to our most latest broad scale study, which is a bird's eye view at all of the different pathways that we can explore here in Canada, and then of course our most recent survey here. And I want to just thank our members, of course, who have made all of this research possible. As I said at the top of this, it really is a commitment to have leaders from across the energy market come together to sort of put skin in the game behind this kind of research in a way that is done so completely objectively. So I just want to give our members kudos and great appreciation for their support. And thanks to all of you for joining us today, for tuning in, and definitely stay tuned. We'll post this recording. So for those that weren't able to make it, please feel to share it with your colleagues. And as always, reach out to the CTA if you have any questions. But thanks again to you, Oksana.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Okay, take care, everyone.